Hey folks, Amanda here. Just a quick heads up that from time to time, the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast does include some adult language. So if you've got kids with you, you may just want to hold on to this episode to listen to a little later. Enjoy! Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast. I'm Amanda Sollman, and along with Mark Jewell, your host for this show and the creator of the Surviving to Thriving movement. Each week, we'll dive into the mindsets that keep us in survival mode and learn how to get on the path to a truly thriving life. If you're looking for a wake-up call and want some valuable tools to get there, you have come to the right place. After all, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. Now, let's head over to the show. Welcome back to another episode of the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast. I'm Amanda Sollman, and I'm so glad you could join me. This week, I am actually flying solo here in the host chair since Mark is out of the country leading what I am sure is a pretty epic personal growth experience for some folks we work with. So I figured I would take this opportunity to actually dive into a topic that my colleague Wade keeps on telling me that I need to teach more people about. So I figured, what better time than this week? So the topic I am going to be digging into is managing and setting expectations. So let me back up a little bit and tell you a little bit about where this concept came from for me. So I started out my career at a marketing agency. We provided advertising, public relations, a whole host of services to companies related to marketing, particularly in the agribusiness space. So at the agency, it was my job to sort of be the middleman, or I guess you could say middle woman, between our clients and between my team at the agency. So whether that was art directors, copywriters, media buyers, PR specialists, whoever at the agency was ultimately responsible for creating a certain project. So I would work with the client to understand their goals, any overarching strategy that they had, timelines, budgets, so on and so forth. And then I would work with my coworkers back at the agency to help get those projects done. Now, I was fresh out of college when I took this job, and I really had very little understanding of what it takes to manage a client relationship. I also happen to be a big perfectionist and a pretty big people pleaser. So as you might expect, perfectionism, people-pleasing is not always the best combination when you're trying to work with clients. Because what was happening in those early days is that I really ended up being sort of an order taker, as opposed to being more of a business partner. So what I mean by that is, if a client said they needed something done by a certain deadline, even if I knew the deadline was unrealistic, I would just say yes. And then I would deal with the consequences later because I didn't want to say no. I didn't want to push back. Another example might be if a client gave me a budget and I knew it really wasn't near enough for what they wanted done, I might agree to it even if that meant that I had to clean up some messes or fix things later. I was really young. I aimed to please. And as a result, I was creating more stress both for myself and my agency team that really didn't need to be there, all because, I was afraid to push back or I was afraid to say no. Enter a new boss. So when I had been at the agency for about a year, they hired a new director for the account that I was working on. And I learned a lot from this person, but one of the many lessons that she taught me was how to be more of a partner for my client, as opposed to just an order taker. And that meant being honest when unrealistic expectations were being asked of the agency. So if we knew that the timeline we were being given was going to be tough to meet, we would talk with the client either about adjustments we could make in the process to get it done faster, or how we could shift the timeline to be more in line with what we knew was realistic. By the same token, if a budget was too low for the type of project we were doing, we'd have a conversation about how we could either execute within the existing budget by changing, any variety of elements, or we might talk about if there was opportunity to find more money for the project to do it at a larger scale or a higher quality or something like that. And what I learned under this boss's guidelines, or under this boss's guidance, is that setting clear expectations on the front end really is key to ensuring success on the back end. And that managing those expectations when things change, because it is inevitable that throughout the course of a project or throughout the course of your career, things will change. Managing expectations throughout can really help you avoid a lot of problems down the road. I also learned that pushing back on a request that you know you can't deliver on is not necessarily a bad thing. Pushing back can actually create a stronger relationship between you and your client or your customer, because they know that you have their best interest at heart and that you don't want them to have to deal with a missed deadline or a blown budget sometime down the road later in the game. So that was a really big deal for me. It was a really big piece of my growth in that position. But the other thing that, in hindsight was also pretty cool is that it wasn't just my clients that I was learning to set and manage expectations with. I was also able to apply this approach with colleagues, or when I was managing up to my boss, who just happened to be the very boss that taught me about managing expectations in the first place. So this is one of, the most useful skills I've really learned throughout my career. And so I figured that I would dive into that today because not only has it been valuable to me, but we've had multiple clients who have also found this really helpful. So I figured, hey, why not do a whole episode on it? So today we are going to dig into 1, what does it mean to set clear expectations? 2, what does it mean to manage those expectations throughout the process? And finally, what could this look like in real life? What might be some examples of what this looks like? So with that, let's dig in. When I think of what it means to set and manage expectations, in my mind, what you're really trying to do is create mutual understanding among all the people involved in any given situation about 4 things. 1, what needs to be done. 2, when it needs to be done. 3, how it needs to be done. And 4, what success looks like. So when this process is working really well, it also helps you deal with any conflict or any disagreement that might pop up in a more proactive way. So if you have been to one of our training events or listened to some of our past podcast episodes, you've probably heard Mark and I talk about this idea that clarity plus certainty equals execution. This means that when you know what you're trying to achieve and you're confident that you have the skills, knowledge, and experience to do it, executing on your goals becomes much, much easier. In my mind, the idea of setting and managing expectations falls into the clarity bucket of that equation. Just think about a time when you haven't had clear expectations. Chances were A, you were probably confused about what you were supposed to be doing, or B, you assumed you knew only to find out that someone was expecting you to do something else. That can really hurt our confidence. It can make us really stressed out. On the flip side, though, when we set and manage expectations better, what we're out to create becomes that much clearer to everybody involved. So let's break this concept down into 2 parts. The first part is setting expectations on the front end, and the second part is managing expectations either when there's disagreement or when new information gets presented. So let's start with the first part, setting expectations on the front end. When I say this out loud, it seems really intuitive. right? So we've all written goals or we've given somebody directions on how to do something or what to do. And so it seems like setting expectations should be super, super easy. Spoiler alert, it's not. For whatever reason, the vast majority of us are terrible at including specifics when we're asking for something. For example, let's say that you're in sales and you are having a conversation with your boss. In the course of the conversation, maybe he tells you, I think you should be making more cold calls to build up your prospect list. Sounds great, right? Wrong. So tell me, what does more mean? Should you be making 3 more cold calls a week? 10 more calls? Also, what does it mean to, quote, build up your prospect list? Should it have 20 more names on it? 100 more names? When we don't set clear expectations, there's a really good chance that one person in the conversation thinks they are doing great, while the other person thinks that, oh my gosh, they're failing miserably. The reason that this often happens is we do one of two things, maybe even both of two things. One is that we use really vague language like a few or more, right? That means different things to different people. The other reason is that sometimes we'll make incorrect assumptions about how something should be done. So those incorrect assumptions could be made based on our ego, AKA, oh, I know what I'm doing. I don't need to ask more questions. Or we might make incorrect assumptions because of some past experience. Oh, I'll just do it like I did it the last time. Both of those, plus, vague language, can get us into trouble. So I am going to tell you how to prevent these mistakes when it comes to setting expectations. But before I do that, I want to take just a quick detour and talk about why many people, especially those who are early in their career, don't push for clearer expectations, right? Especially if you're a manager, you would think that, oh, if I don't give somebody enough information, they'll just ask for it, right? So often, folks aren't asking for the extra information. And I see one big reason as to why that's not happening. So, when I'm in coaching calls, I have talked with a lot of professionals who will express frustration that, their boss, sometimes their client or their customer, but really their boss, is not telling them what their expectations are, right? They're not giving them enough feedback. And so, they'll express some frustration along the lines of, oh, my boss doesn't tell me what he wants, or I didn't know that was what my boss wanted. And it will almost always be followed by some variation of a statement that sounds like this. Well, they're the boss. They should be the one telling me what to do or giving me feedback. I shouldn't have to ask. That's not my job. I am here to tell you right now, if this is your belief, you need to crumple it up and throw it in the trash. Here's why. First off, this belief to me is really rooted in some old ideas about what power structures or what hierarchy should look like in companies. Right? It's kind of hearkening back to a day, whether this day actually existed or not, but maybe an imaginary day where it was the job of many managers just to manage people, right? Like that was their responsibility. But the reality is that is not the case anymore. In modern workplaces, managers often have almost a full-time job with their own responsibilities, and then managing a team gets layered in on top of that, right? So it's really hard to expect that A, they're going to remember to tell you everything all the time, or B, that they've even been taught how to manage and communicate with their team effectively in the first place. Okay? You cannot expect your boss to pull all of the weight when it comes to making sure you're successful. That brings me to my second point. around why this belief, oh, it's my boss's job to tell me everything they expect of me, why that's garbage. Let me ask you this. Who suffers when expectations aren't met or a project fails because you didn't ask enough questions on the front end? 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be your boss that's suffering. It's going to be you. Probably many of you have heard the phrase, quote, holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. It's my belief that setting expectations and making sure you have clarity works the same way. If you are complaining because you didn't get clear enough directions or you're blaming your failure on your boss for not giving you enough feedback, in reality, the only one suffering is you. You have to take more responsibility over getting your stuff done. Finally, the last reason that this, it's my boss's job to tell me what to do mentality is crap, to be honest. This mentality will always leave you feeling like you have no control over your own success. Okay. You're going to work too many hours trying to chase a moving target because you don't actually know what that target looks like. You'll lose confidence because you just don't know what people want. So it's your responsibility to make sure you have clear expectations before and during any project. When you realize this, you're also going to have a realization about how much power you actually control in any given situation. Okay, so relying on your boss solely to tell you what to do is a really dumb idea. Agreed? Agreed. Let's move on. Whether you are setting expectations with your boss, a client, a customer, heck, this even works with your spouse and kids sometimes. Here are 4 questions that I really think you should be asking. Question number 1, what is the work that needs to be done? Now, this is usually the part that people tell you, right? Make more cold calls, plan a meeting, write a proposal, submit that report, and so on and so on and so on. That being said, you do need to watch out for conversations where the what isn't completely clear. I know that there are situations where a group will often talk around a problem, or they'll do a lot of complaining, but never actually get to an action plan. So in those instances especially, you really have to ask, what do you want me to do? Okay, so first question, what's the work that needs to be done? The second question, how does it need to be done? This is where you are asking for a lot of the details, right? So things like the budget, any details about the location where something should happen. If there's work that needs to be done on a certain day of the week, if there's a certain size business you should be focusing on, a key contact that you should be working with, specific numbers about sales, right? Should you be selling X tons of feed or X bags of seed? Like, get into the specifics, get granular. If you have any questions, if you are not sure about something, ask. Remember, it is your responsibility to ask the question so you know all the details. Okay? So that's question 2. How does it need to be done? Question number 3. When does it need to be done? In my experience, this is one of the biggest areas where expectations and expectation setting can fall apart. Right? So there are a lot of times when we'll assume that we either know how hot a project is or isn't until your boss is asking you if you're done with it and you haven't even started. So that's the first piece of timeliness is, what's the deadline? Now, in addition to deadlines, I also recommend that you have a conversation around expected turnaround times where they're relevant, if they could impact your reaching your deadline. So for example, let's say, you're a nutritionist, and you might say, on average, it takes me 3 days to create a new feed ration. Once I have the time to be in the office and I talk with, my feed mill manager and all of the things that go into that, on average, you can expect that it takes 3 days to create that new ration. So what I recommend is when you've got average turnaround times like that, make it clear to everyone who's involved in the process what those turnaround times are, because otherwise you're constantly going to be, dealing with fires where people call you and say, hey, I need this in 2 hours. And you're like, whoa, I can't do that in 2 hours, right? So timing has two parts. One is the deadline. Two is how long on average does it take to do certain things? Okay, that's question 3. When does it need to be done? Question 4, what does success look like? So for example, what would make this event we're planning worth your time? How will you know if I've done a good job? What would make you happy with my work? I always encourage people to ask their boss, their client, their customer, especially on big projects, to paint you a picture of what success would look like. Because then it makes it really easy for you to go out and create it. Or at least it should, in theory, be easier to go out and create it when you know what they expect of you. Okay? So that's the 4th question. What does success look like? Now, when you're asking these questions, there's a pretty good chance that in the what, how, and when area specifically, someone's going to ask you to do something that you don't think you can do. As I've mentioned before, this, for whatever reason, is particularly true around budgets and timelines. People often underestimate how much it'll cost to do something, or they underestimate how long it will take to do something. There's a lot of other areas where this could come up, but I do see budgets and timelines specifically being an area of potential trouble. So when this happens, first things first, never, never, never automatically agree to something that you're pretty sure you can't deliver on. Okay. I know there are probably a lot of you out there who are people pleasers, and I am telling you, you need to resist your gut instinct to automatically say yes. So whether you say, let me talk to my team and get back to you, or I need to check on a few things and I'll call you tomorrow and see what we can do. Like, do something to buy yourself some time. But if your first instinct is, oh my gosh, I can't do that, don't say yes. Okay? And the reason for that is there is always room for negotiation if you think that unrealistic expectations are being asked of you. So for example, when I was at the agency, a client might ask for something to be turned around on a very tight timetable. However, I was also aware that they had a pretty extensive legal and regulatory review that every ad, every sell sheet, every press release, everything had to go through. And sometimes that review process could take up to 2 weeks or even more to get through. So what I might do when there was a time, that I was being asked for a tight deadline is I might say, you know what? Sure, I can make that tight timeline happen, but only if you can push your legal and regulatory team to shorten up their review window, right? So if they agreed to that, then, we'd both work hard to follow through on our promises. I'd push things faster on my end. They'd push things faster on their end. However, if they said, it's just not possible to make those reviews go faster, then we can renegotiate the deadline based on, what we need to build in for a realistic review period. Always, always, always remember, under-promise and over-deliver. If you over-promise and under-deliver, it will get you in trouble every time. Okay. So once you've outlined the what, the how, and the when of everything, and you know what your boss or your client or your customer thinks success will look like. Now it's time to really clearly communicate and outline this so that there's no confusion later on. Okay. Especially when it comes to big projects or high dollar agreements, a verbal commitment is never enough. You need to have an approved estimate or a contract or a proposal, a backup email, something that you can reference later if you need to. Even with smaller projects, I like to shoot over a quick email that just says, hey, these are the things we agreed to and next steps. Does this look good to you? All right. Make sure that you get a reply of their agreement and then just store that email for later if you need it. One piece of advice on this. Once you have that agreement in writing, be sure to refer to it early and often. Right? So each time you move on to the next phase of the project, for example, do a check-in. You might say, hey, based on our earlier conversations or, based on our contract, this is what we're going to be doing to move forward. Are you still good with that? Or has anything changed that I need to account for and then adjust accordingly? This is just a really good way and a really good habit to get into to remind all of the parties involved what was agreed to, and then make sure, that no one drops the ball on anything along the way. Okay. So that is part one, setting expectations on the front end. Ask what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, when it needs to be done. Ask what success looks like, and then get all of that in writing for reference later if you need it. If you do these parts really well, this next part should be a lot easier. Now, it won't always be the case that you've been able to set expectations on the front end. And even if you do, they won't always prevent problems later down the road. But, 80% of the time, 90% of the time, if you do really good on the front end, setting those expectations, you will make your life a lot easier down the road. So in part two, now we're talking about managing expectations when there's conflict or when new information presents itself. It really never fails that even after you set clear expectations on the front end, something's going to change along the way. I'm going to give you a few examples of what that could look like when things change. So, example number one. Let's say on Monday, your boss gives you a project and says, hey, this needs to be done by Friday. However, you know that your plate is already full with projects that your boss has given you, and you're really struggling with how you're going to handle one more thing. Okay, so that's example number one. And I'll come back to how to deal with each of these in a little bit, but let's walk through a couple more examples. Example number two, maybe you put together a price quote for a customer, and this customer has asked you for just whatever the lowest price is possible you give them. Okay. Now you agree to that low price, but later in the year, that customer calls you and now he wants some extra service, right? He wants some advice. He wants you to come look at his setup, any number of things. But because he really wanted that bottom of the barrel pricing on the front end, you didn't include any extra service in your quote. So what do you do? Okay, that's example two. And finally, example three. Your client calls and says, oh my gosh, my budget has been completely slashed and I don't have enough money to finish this project that we're working on. Unfortunately, it's a project you're already halfway through. Okay. Again, what do you do? So first things first, did you set clear expectations up front and get it in writing? If the answer is yes, always go there first. You refer to your approved estimate, contract, proposal, or forward an old email, if you need to jog their memory about what was agreed to, because sometimes that will be enough. Sometimes people just forget what they committed to. Right? So in the example about the customer who originally just wanted cheap, but now wants service, you might forward them the approved contract that they sign and remind them, no additional services were available at that price point. Right? So then you can discuss, any options for adding a la carte services at an additional cost. You can also have a conversation about, how you'd be happy to provide those services in the future as part of, incorporated into a larger package, but that your time is valuable, right? And so you're going to need to build that into the price, right? So you start with the agreement and then move on from there. Now, sometimes that written agreement still isn't going to be enough. For example, the client who got his budget slashed, he still doesn't have any money now, even despite the fact that he agreed to paying more on the front end. So in situations like that, you're going to need to work out something else as a solution, which I'm going to get to here in just a second. Now, if you didn't set clear expectations up front, first off, there's no better time than the present to get started. So go back to talking about the what, the how, the when, the what does success look like questions that I went through earlier. Start setting expectations now. However, you probably also need to be prepared to hear things like, well, we didn't agree to that, or you didn't tell me that, or I didn't know that, right? The best you can do at this point is start communicating clearly about what needs to happen moving forward. But because some of those expectations were set on the front end, you're probably going to need to work through some short-term solutions to deal with that disagreement or that conflict right away. So again, doing the work on the front end saves you a lot of headaches on the back end. So as much as you can do that, really, really, really try to ask for that information up front. Now, maybe, having those expectations on the front end wasn't enough, or maybe you didn't set good expectations, so now you need to figure out what to do moving forward. Here's what I recommend. When something changes in the process, you can kind of break up this conversation into 3 sections and then a follow-up question of some sort. So the 3 sections are: 1, re-outline the situation; 2, make clear what the new challenge is that you're needing to overcome; 3, provide your solution or ask them what they think should be the solution. And finally, that follow-up question, I want you to ask, is that something you'd be open to, or some variation of that? So let's go back to the examples that I mentioned earlier and kind of walk through what this conversation could look like. So I already talked about how to approach that customer who wanted more service than they paid for. That's primarily a, hey, go back to the documentation conversation. But let's talk about the other 2 examples. So for the boss that added more to your plate, you might say something like, Sally, we'll call her Sally. Sally, I know this new project is hot and that you want it done by Friday. Unfortunately, I've also got this other project that you assigned me last week that's also due on Friday. Now, I'm going to do my best to get both of them done, but as I'm looking at my calendar and some of the other things that we've got going on this week, I'm just not sure that I'm going to be able to get them both done by Friday at the quality level that I know you and I both want. So I'd really love your feedback. Which do you think should be my first priority to work on? Okay, so that's an example of how that conversation could go. So in this situation, we're reminding our boss, that she already assigned us something else due on Friday, and that both projects require significant time and attention. She might have forgotten about that other project, or she might not realize, how much work that other project is taking. So the first thing is to remind her of the current situation. Okay. We're also saying, we'll do our best we'll do our best to tackle both of these projects. But we're also planting the seed of awareness that it might not be possible to get them both done. This is key to the under-promise and over-deliver premise, okay? Finally, we're going to make Sally take responsibility for what she thinks is the most important and get her to clearly articulate that. Okay. So in this situation, the key takeaway is that, you want to work with Sally to create realistic expectations about your workload and what you can and can't do in any given time. Right. And you want to be careful of not overcommitting to work that you can't do. Because you can imagine in, another situation where you don't manage the expectations that, what I see is one of two scenarios could happen. One, you agree to getting both projects done, and then because you literally just don't have the capacity for that, the ball gets dropped on one of them, right? And so now you're in trouble. Sally's not happy. No good. The other possible scenario is that you just agree to both projects and then you put in a ton of extra time, taking away from your personal time to get both projects done. So you might get them both done by Friday, but you've sacrificed your personal time to do it. And now you've trained Sally to know that she can just put whatever on your plate, regardless of whether it cuts into personal time or not. Okay. Both of those outcomes are less than desirable. So setting expectations and getting Sally to prioritize, that's going to be better for both of you. Okay? So that's the first example. Let's look at the example where the client got his budget slashed. Okay. So here's how that conversation could go. You might say, John, thanks for letting me know about the changes in your budget. I know we had a signed estimate that was already agreed to, but obviously we're going to need to re-examine how we get the project done under your new budget restrictions. So here's where I'm at currently. We're about halfway through this project already, and I think that based on the money that you now have available, the cost for the work that we've done so far, we're going to be able to cover that. Okay? So that just leaves the second half of the project that you and I need to figure out. So my suggestion, you have this project that you were talking about doing, 6 months down the road, and we had earmarked some money for that. What I would suggest is that we eliminate that project and then we reallocate those funds to finish up this current project. I know it's not perfect, but I do think it is the right move for us as part of your larger strategy. So I'm just curious, is that something you'd be open to doing? Okay, so that's how that conversation could go. In this situation, you're reminding your client, John, that he did agree to spending a certain amount of money with you. Okay, so technically you could hold him to that, but the reality is you're here to be his partner. You're not here to be an enemy. And so you're willing to work with him to find a win-win situation under these new circumstances that, let's be real, he didn't ask for, right? Probably somebody higher than him cut budget, so now he's just trying to deal with the consequences of that. Okay, so you want to be a partner. You've also reiterated what the current situation is, so he knows that that paying for or not paying for the work that's already been done, like that's not an option, right? You have to get paid for the work that your team's already put in, so that's not negotiable. However, you also came up with a solution. So, number one, John knows you've been thinking about ideas to help him out. When you say, hey, let's reallocate funds from this other project you were thinking about, he knows, oh, hey, she was kind of looking ahead. Okay. The other thing you're doing is you're bringing your professional opinion and idea to the table. And ultimately, that's what he pays you for. He pays you for your insight, your expertise. And so by bringing a solution, you're showing that you have an opinion as a professional, as an expert to bring to the conversation. Now, finally, by asking him, is this something you'd be open to? You have now given him the opportunity to either say yes, in which case, revise your written agreement and move forward under the new terms, or you've given him the opportunity to say no, he doesn't like that solution, in which case now you get to have a conversation about what other possible solutions might be available. The important piece in this example is that you're never agreeing to give work away for free. You are just working out a new option in kind of a cruddy circumstance. Okay. So that's it. Setting and managing expectations. Super easy, right? It might sound like that when I say it and when I walk through the examples, but trust me, this really takes practice. It takes practice learning to say no. It takes practice getting comfortable with making someone else compromise. And it takes practice learning to value your time and expertise. The other thing that can happen, and that takes practice, is that you might potentially disappoint someone because you won't always do everything they ask, right? So there'll be a lot of times when they'll ask for something and you'll be like, great, sounds good. But that won't always happen. What I can guarantee you is that this will get easier over time when you do it over and over again. I can also guarantee you that becoming good at this, becoming good at setting really clear expectations and then managing them along the way, this will help you earn the respect of your colleagues, your managers, your clients, your customers. Because when you do this, they know that you're not just a doormat who takes orders and asks no questions. They also know that you can think for yourself and really critically think about a situation. And that's useful for everybody involved. Here's just a handful of examples of where our clients have been practicing this idea of setting and managing expectations. We had one person who had a boss that their boss just expected an immediate response to emails, voicemails, texts, anything at any time of the day. And originally that person was getting really frustrated because maybe they were in a conversation with a customer or maybe they were at home on personal time. And it was really frustrating that their boss was expecting them to drop everything to respond. And so what this person got to do was set expectations around, what his boss should expect for average response times, right? So, if you send me a text between, 8 and 5 on a regular business day, I'll get back to you, in a couple of hours. Or, if you leave me a voicemail, on the weekend, I might not get back to you till Monday morning, right? He got to decide what those kind of ground rules were, but then set those expectations with his boss and make sure that his boss agreed to those terms. Okay. So that's one example. We had one person who they were told that they had to make a number of customer calls every week. But then just due to the nature of what was going on in their company, they kept being repeatedly assigned to other tasks that were filling their time and filling a lot of time. And so what they got to do was continually go to their manager and reiterate the expectations about how they should be spending their time. And then how, which projects were priority. So they got to ask, okay, I know I'm supposed to be making X number of customer calls this week, but I also was assigned to do all of these things, which ended up taking a really big chunk of my week. So, which should I be prioritizing? Or, even going into a brand new week, touching base Monday morning and saying, okay, should I be focusing on customer calls or should I take extra tasks if they're assigned to me? Ask those questions so that everybody's on the same page. We had another person who, thought they were doing a good job, but their boss, for whatever reason, never seemed happy with their performance. So that person really got to ask a lot of clarifying questions about what success should look like. And then, final example, real life example, we had one person who was really struggling to keep up with their email, right? Rarely were they at their computer, and so they were just overloaded with their inbox. And so they got to set expectations with their team about, what would his average response time for emails be, but also what should be the alternative ways to communicate if his team needed a quicker response, right? Because he was in a situation where his team would be like, I sent an email a week ago and I still haven't heard back, right? And so he got to set expectations around, okay, if you need a response in a day, this is how you get a hold of me. If you need a response in a couple of days, here's how you get a hold of me, and so on and so forth. So this can be applied in a ton of different situations. It can also be set, right, like when you're setting goals for yourself. So you can use the same structure to get a lot of clarity from your boss around what those goals should be. This is really just the tip of the iceberg because when you start paying attention, you will realize how often you and other people both give really vague directions and don't ask enough questions. So I'm hoping that by putting some of these tips to use, you'll start to feel a greater sense of clarity, maybe in areas that you have been feeling frustrated. So hope these help. With that brings me to the end of this episode. Just a quick note, we do have 2 leadership programs coming up this spring. There will be a Millennial Mastermind program kicking off in April, which is designed for early career professionals. And then there will be a Thriving Leader program kicking off in May, which is designed for people managers, company leaders, that sort of thing. Both of these programs include a 2-day live training event followed by 3 months of weekly coaching calls. And you can find more information about both of those on our website at www.markjeweltraining.com. And that is Jewel with 2 L's. So thanks again, as always, for tuning in. And remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. Let's go get it. Thanks for tuning in to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast. You can find the show notes and links to all the resources mentioned in this episode by heading over to markjeweltraining.com/podcast. And if you feel so inclined, we'd love it if you could head over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. That's what helps us move up in the charts so that more people can find us and start their surviving to thriving journey. See you next week.